Good evening and welcome. This program is part of UK's Art and Science Passport program, where every year they focus on one country, one area, and have a full year of lectures, activities, programs concerning that one area. We've done South Africa, we've done Russia, Mexico last year, and this year, for the full academic year, we will focus on the year of the Middle East. We've already had our kickoff, our first event, Kosher Soul, but this is one of our first major events of this year of the Middle East. And so I want to first thank Arts and Science and UK for this opportunity to hold these series of activities. And we are so honored and thankful to have as our first major lecturer, Dr. Professor John Esposito, who undoubtedly is one of the world-renowned scholars of Islam. We are so honored to have him in our presence. Professor Esposito is Italian-American. Some of the things maybe you don't know about him, he was raised in Brooklyn, New York, in a traditional Italian-American family, in a traditional Italian-American neighborhood.
I think he got this information from the NSA, but we won't go there.
The CIA and NSA are all wonderful sources of information, John. You should know that. And he was the first in his family actually to graduate from high school, let alone college. Another thing you might not know about John Esposito is that he spent 10 years in a monastery training to be a priest, Catholic priest. He left the monastery at age 24 to pursue an academic career in theology, Catholic theology. And he received his master's in theology from St. John's College. And then he went to Temple University to get a PhD in Catholicism. But then he hit a bump in the road. As he was pursuing his degree in Catholicism, he had to choose another religion. And he happened to take a course by a professor named Ismail Faruqi, and that changed his life. And he decided over a period of time to change his focus to Islam. Even today I asked him why. He said, well, it's really hard to explain how he made such a radical jump in his career. I must say, we are all very thankful that you did make that change in your career. And he graduated with a PhD in religion with focus on Islamic studies in 1974. And, you know, John came around at a time in the late 70s, early 80s, when the Muslim world was changing. A revival was happening in the Muslim world. Islam in the 40s, 50s, into the 60s seemed to be a dead subject. But a revival took place in the Muslim world. And then that revival took political form, and the main one being the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran. John said that he thanks Khomeini so much for making his career, because all of a sudden Islam became an important field to study. And so John Esposito was there at the right time. And what a great contributor he has made. From teaching at College of Holy Cross for almost 20 years, then he went on to Georgetown University to teach for now about 20 years, where he founded the Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. And in that career, in what is about 40 years of, in the academic field, he has produced, unbelievably, about 49 books and monographs. He has produced about 105 articles, chapters or articles in academic publications. He is the editor-in-chief of 6 encyclopedias or reference works, all of them by Oxford, including the Oxford Encyclopedia of Islam, the Islamic World. And he has produced many books that pave the way for understanding this revival, this Islamic revival, and this phenomena of, if you will, political Islam. His early books, Islam and Politics, Islam and Democracy, Islam the Straight Path, the Iranian Revolution, and then later at Georgetown, and most recently, his books, Who Speaks for Islam, What a Billion Muslims Really Think, which is in collaboration with the Gallup organization, and done with Dalia Mugahed. Then What Everyone Should Know About Islam. Then more recently, Islamophobia and the Challenge of Pluralism in the 21st Century. And then most recently, The Future of Islam, published in 2010. He early on served as president of the Middle East Studies Association. And then recently, almost kind of a climax of his career, he was recognized for his contribution by being elected as the president of the American Academy of Religion, and where he served as the president in 2013. We really are here to listen and to celebrate such a wonderful career and contributor to this field, John Esposito.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. That was a wonderful introduction. I'm one to say, particularly to students, and what I'm saying is literally true, because when I say it, people always think that I'm exaggerating or being humble or something. I'm one of 3 boys. I'm the oldest, and I'm the least intelligent. Was probably the least that anybody would expect to be an academic. I gave a talk in Maine once, and some faculty came over to me after and said, "Oh, your parents are so cute. You know, we asked them, you know, what they thought of when they saw you up there, you know, with a big audience." And my mother said, "At least he has a job. At least he has a job." And then they said, "You know, what was I like as a kid?" And you know, they don't run it anymore, but there used to be this commercial where, you know, an Italian mother would yell out the window to her kid to come home. It was Prince Spaghetti. You know, there's going to be a meal. Well, for us, it meant either there was hot water. The landlady finally gave hot water so we could take a bath. Or it meant we had to go up and read every day in the summertime for an hour. So they asked what I was like, and she said, "Well, I had 3 boys, and the 2 youngest loved to read, and with John, I had to get books with lots of pictures." So my career really was very jump-started. And you know, my middle brother, to encourage my niece, once said, "Just look at your Uncle John. Look at his background. If he can do it, anybody can do so." So that's where we are on that. Now, tonight I'm going to talk about the future of Islam. There's so much that one could say under that theme. I'm going to come at it from a very different kind of point of view, but I'm also going to try to do something I often don't do, which is to sort of keep it sort of crisp and allow lots of time for Q&A, because I'm not going to cover everything. The first thing I should say is, in case you're feeling tense about this and thinking about what time will this end and when will I leave, I have a new technique. The doors are locked, so students who want to leave, it may be a fire hazard, but you don't get out till I finish. And Ihsan has offered to buy breakfast tomorrow in case I go on and on. So when we look at religion in society, and we look at religion today, and we want to talk about the future of Islam, in a globalized world, where increasingly, unlike 30, 40 years ago, societies are multi-ethnic and multi-religious because of immigration, because of the the coming of religions, in particular in the 70s, from, if you will, we call them Eastern religions, although Islam is really a Western religion, Hinduism and Buddhism. It's somewhat difficult to realize where we were as a nation in terms of religion in the past. In 1955, a very prominent book was written, which was seen as it was a sociologist of religion who wrote it, kind of definitive book on where America was. And it was called Protestant, Catholic, and Jew. That was it, full stop. And in fact, the fact that Catholics were in there was what was unique. Before it was Protestants and Jews. That was 55. Proud to say in 2013, if they did it again, it would be Catholics, Protestants, and Jews. We've overtaken them through birth, the Supreme Court, and you name it. We no longer are the people who are simply seen as the great laborers, the people who are into construction companies, work well building buildings and patios with cement, or put people in cement. We have now moved forward. 10 years after that, though, 10 years after that, suddenly we had the God is dead theology. And people were talking about, major theologians, that God was dead. Now, some of them meant God is dead, or passé, but most of them meant our traditional notions of God don't work anymore in a modern world, in a scientific world, and that unless we reconfigure our theology, we're going to continue to perpetuate a notion of God and a way of understanding God in theology that is dead. 10 years after that, the person who wrote at the time of God is Dead a book called The Secular City, in which he was not saying that God was dead. This is Harvey Cox, who's a great read on almost anything, teaches at Harvard. Cox had written The Secular City basically saying America and our society, our culture is secular, and so religion's got to deal with that, and that's weakening religion. But 10 years later, it became turning east, because suddenly we had gurus and Zen masters, and we had populations. Our immigration policies were much more open, populations coming that had never been here. So that when I was in graduate school, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism were invisible in the landscape. I was raised in cosmopolitan New York. I never passed a Hindu temple or a Buddhist temple. I never saw a mosque. And so the world in which, for many of you who are students, the world in which you've grown up is much different than only 30 or 40 years ago. That has all kinds of implications, both domestically in terms of American policy, in terms of our sense of being a multi-ethnic society, in terms of the way in which we respond to a religion that we didn't know anything about, and I'll talk about that in a second. If you know nothing about a religion and then suddenly you see people shouting death to America in Iran, and doing it in the name of their religion or Islam, you're liable to say that's the way they always are. And that must be what they're all like. Let me just point out another reason why I want to talk about the topic and approach it the way I do. While there are 5 great world religions, it's 2 that actually have interacted most intimately over history, Islam and Christianity. And those 2 are the first and second of the largest of the world's religions. 2.3 billion Christians, 1.6 billion Muslims. As you know, Catholics are the largest Christian group. Muslims now are larger than Catholics. Okay? Then you drop to 1.1 billion Hindus, 500 million Buddhists, and about 14 million Jews. So Muslims and Christians amount to 1/2 of the world's population, roughly, and they interact globally, okay, across the world, which is not the case when we look at the other faiths, not to the same extent. And they interact both as faiths, but also interact in terms of politics and society. And all of that comes to play when we look at where we are today, where Islam is today, and the future of Islam, both in the US, in the West, and overseas. If Islam was invisible in the US and Europe only 30, 40 years ago, today it is the 2nd or 3rd largest religion. It's the third largest in America and the second largest in a number of European countries. There are some 25 million Muslims in Europe alone. Part of the talk also has to be framed in terms of the nature of religion. This is as I see it, okay? Which of course means it's right, but anyway, we don't want to go there. That's right, the mic's on. All right. They'll learn that you're right. Just keep telling them. All right. No matter what religion we're talking about, you see, if it's our religion, believers always feel that their faith is good, pure, and true. And so if something went wrong in Catholicism, we would say, that's not real Catholicism. That's not Holy Mother the Church. But we could look at other faiths and say, look at what they're doing. Because too often we don't compare our ideal to somebody else's ideal religiously. We compare our ideal to somebody else's reality when it's convenient. So religions have a transcendent and a dark side. The transcendent side is, in religious faiths, there is a belief that there is something, God, an absolute, an experience such as nirvana, that is beyond our normal empirical way and consciousness and the way we live. There is another dimension of reality, as it were, that is not simply accessed through, if you will, empirical data. But religion's transcendent dimension is also the fact that it enables its followers to transcend themselves, to be better, okay? And in all faiths, there's a notion of struggling against, as it were, your sinful side or your dark side or your imperfect side or your self-centered side. As I tell my wife, being self-centered is not all that bad. But anyway, that's just a parenthetical comment. It may be because I think she thinks that's the case. But it's that transcendent side that attracts people to religion. Science answers the question, how? Religion attempts often to answer the questions, why? Why am I here? What should I be doing? Where am I going? Why is it important that I be good rather than bad? What that means then is that when we deal with religion, we have saints and we have sinners. We have those who struggle in what one might regard as just and holy causes. I don't want to use the phrase holy wars here. And then we have people who seize and abuse religion. We can talk about centuries of militant jihads, but we have to talk about also centuries of crusades and crusaders. When I first went out to speak as a young man, I was speaking at the University of Chicago, and it was chaired by Fazlur Rahman, a very prominent professor at the University of Chicago, and there were two other speakers before me. So there were like three, actually, total of three. And he said, you know, we have a young graduate student here who's just finished his degree. He's very nervous about this presentation. He also has to catch a plane. Now, instead of putting me first, I was still last. So he said to them, can we skip the first part of your talks? You know, the denunciation of the Crusades and European colonialism. Get to the heart of your talk, then it'll be briefer, and then we can get to Esposito's talk, okay? So depending on where you're coming from, we have different senses of history, our finer moments, and our grievances, and that plays out today. So let's take a look at where we are today and how we need to understand and why we haven't understood religion that well in the past, and particularly Islam. When the Iranian Revolution came along, it is true, I felt that I owed my career because I had finished my degree. I was like, again, some of you are old enough, you remember that commercial for Maytag, waiting for the phone to ring? Well, you know, the academic in the ivory tower, my phone never rang, nobody ever invited me to speak, and this was for the first 6 to 7 years. Anything I did seemed very esoteric. I was hired to teach world religions, not teach Islam, and then the revolution came along. So I owe my career, my first Lexus, to the Ayatollah Khomeini. It's quite literally true. I had only made it to a Toyota Camry, and suddenly I could jump to a Lexus. But that says something about where we were. At that time, if I sent out book contracts, and I did, you know, I sent out book proposals, 100. 97 didn't answer, 3 said, great idea, no market. Iranian Revolution came, 3 book contracts in 5 weeks. Iranian Revolution came, and suddenly government wanted to know what was going on. Our diplomats were not trained in the religions and cultures of countries that they went to, Hinduism, Buddhism, or Islam if they were in Asia. Our military were not, even though they might be engaging people. The media did not cover religion in any significant way. I used to do a program, I did the color commentary for the first Gulf War, so I knew what it was to be on in prime time, to have camera crews come to my house. Then I do a great dialogue show, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, Sunday morning, 6 a.m. And the only reason they did it is that they were required. Stations had to have community programs and religion programs. It wasn't even that the stations were necessarily anxious to do it. So our population was not acclimatized to other religions, particularly if they didn't interact with them, in the public square. Tom Brokaw, who used to do the Today Show during the taking of the American hostages, began one morning saying, "Before I give my report, let me tell you that there's a religion called Islam. It has a book called the Quran and a prophet called Muhammad." That's pretty amazing in a country that saw itself as having a cosmopolitan global worldview and an educational system. Most of us, if we went to any country in the world and you were talking to an educated class and they never heard of Jesus or Moses or the Bible, you'd be saying, "On what planet are you?" Now, if it were an esoteric religion like Jainism, that for many people in those days had never heard of, that might be understandable. But to be dealing with what even then was the second largest of the world's religions. Barry Serafin, who used to be at the gate every morning to get from Miriam, the spokesperson for the Iranian students who are holding the hostages, she would begin with Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, in the name of God, the merciful and compassionate. That's the way Muslims begin, pious Muslims, a speech, a presentation, a letter, etc., anything important in life. And then usually there's a little quote from the Quran. Barry, after a while, getting frustrated every day, in effect said, without using quite these words, "I've got 5 minutes for this report. I want to know how they are. Could you cut out the first part?" I mean, it'd be like, I don't know what, visiting the Pope or going to something that the Pope does or somebody like him. He begins with a little prayer and somebody says, "Could we just get this going?" We only have a half hour for this program. But also think of the implications there. Jimmy Carter, as president, the day that Jimmy Carter was responding to the Iranian parliament, which said that if America repents of what it's done to Iran, meaning our foreign policy, etc., our restoration of a Shah who had been kicked out of the country and then was brought back on a CIA plane. That was a time when not only did the head of the CIA, who was the brother of the Secretary of State, and General Schwarzkopf, some of you remember him from the first, his father was a general, and that's why General Schwarzkopf was raised in Iran for a while. We brought him back. Well, 4 of us were asked to brief the Secretary of State, National Security Council, etc. And during our briefing, we said things like, I'm going in a direction that I didn't intend to do, but I think I'm doing really well. I just thought I'd tell you that. I go with sort of on inspiration. So 4 of us that day said a couple of memorable things. Number one, we pointed out that in Islam, repentance doesn't mean confessing your faults publicly. That kind of guilt. In my tradition, we call Catholic guilt, that what it means is sin is when you depart from the straight path of Islam. Repentance is when you get back to the straight path. If you stop doing what's wrong, you do what's right. Just hold that in your mind for a second. The other was I talked about the influence of Ayatollah Khomeini and the influence on youth of a man named Ali Shariati, who was Iranian. His father was a religious leader, but Shariati had a PhD from the Sorbonne and was very much into interpreting Shia Islam in terms of issues of social justice, changing an authoritarian ruler, therefore, etc. So one of the fellows from the State Department And not everybody at State was like that, but this guy was fairly seasoned. He pointed out that he had served in the Middle East for 25 years. He said, we have to get Ali Shariati. We have to find him. Tell us where we can get him. So I kept avoiding the question for a while, and he finally said with great frustration, Professor, I'm asking you, where is he? Where can we find him? I said, well, he's in a cemetery. He's been dead for 8 years. Now, here we were dealing with this crisis, and it showed you how unprepared we were in terms of our experts, because in the old days, in education, Islam was not being taught, nor Hinduism or Buddhism in most colleges or universities. So most educated people didn't deal with it. If you were trained as an area specialist, there was a good chance that you only dealt with religion in the past, because modernization and development theory said that becoming a modern nation state meant you would become secular, and that religion would be confined to private life. And at best, it was an obstacle to development. Therefore, there was no need. So you might study Islam when you're looking at the emergence of the Iranian Empire, but you wouldn't be dealing with Islam as a living religion. A friend of mine was in the embassy and was criticized by her colleagues because she used to go out and meet the religious scholars, or even go to the universities and meet youth and meet people who were, studying not only sciences, but also were studying Islam. So when the Iranian Revolution came along, for most Americans, one saw the faith through that lens. The lens of a revolution, the lens of people who were saying death to America, the lens of people that had a U.S. flag with marked through it, the hammer and sickle marked through it, and then Allah in the middle of it. That was the exposure. That was the extent of the exposure for many. Fast forward then, a lot happens in between, to 9/11. 9/11 for America is one of the most traumatic events in our history. Even more for some than Pearl Harbor, because it was mainland U.S. that was hit. All of our wars, all of our great wars were always fought someplace else. Remember how traumatized we were, those of you that are old enough and others who don't. I traveled across America for 6 months instead of going overseas, etc., right after 9/11. And what amazed me was no matter where you were, you had flags all over the place, you had supportive signs, and you also had other signs like kill them all and let Allah decide. But the point is, this was a tragedy that touched everybody. Now, part of that is because of our nature of communications today. People saw those events live. Okay. But the reality of it was that if you look at it, and I want to understand this correctly, it could be misunderstood. We lost 3,000 people. Symbolically, of course, our economic center was hit and our political center, but we lost 3,000 plus people. That was a tragedy for our nation. But think about in how many wars hundreds of thousands of people die in that war. Whether it was in Iraq, a war that we fought, whether it was in Vietnam, but also if you think about places like Cambodia, Rwanda, in terms of deaths. But for us, and to explain often in foreign countries the extent to which it touched us, but it did touch us that deeply. And naturally, when it touches you that deeply, the question is, who are the people they're going to pay for it? Now, we can discuss ISIS, by the way, in the Q&A. I'm not going to do ISIS tonight. If you don't know what ISIS is, we'll get to it in a second. It's terrible because it's a terrorist group. But when they first started to use the term, all I could think of was, as a kid in an Italian-American neighborhood, we talked about ICE, Italian ISIS. And so, it was Italian ISIS, So, when I was first hearing it, I understood if they said the Islamic whatever, but ISIS was, I'm not good with acronyms, as you can tell. And there was bin Laden. And what was bin Laden saying to us? Now, again, most people miss this. If you look at bin Laden's early speeches, his speeches were not about theology, the first part of the speech. They were about grievances. Everything from the Crusades to Palestine and Israel to American foreign policy to American presence in the Middle East. to not wanting to see America in the first Gulf War come into the Middle East because he said to the king of Saudi Arabia, once they come in, they won't leave, we'll become more dependent. And indeed, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain became more dependent on us, our military base there, more dependent economically, buying our weapons, etc. But what also came out of it was that when he went to legitimate, to mobilize, and this is exactly what ISIS does, to legitimate, mobilize, and recruit, first you give the political, social, economic grievances, so you got people who are mad, as it were, you're getting them really mad about their situation. And then you use religion to legitimate what you're going to do. Remember that whether we're talking about Hitler, Stalin, Saddam Hussein, George W. Bush, Clinton, Obama, okay? So we can look at good guys, good wars, bad wars. When all of those folks go to war, none of them say, I'm being recorded, aren't I? That doesn't matter, I'm from Brooklyn. We're bastards, we're terrorists. They all wind up justifying what they do, just as the Japanese did when they hit us at Pearl Harbor in terms of rationale. It's always that there's an overwhelming enemy and we are now going after them. And so we justify that in terms of democracy, or we justify that in terms of religion, or it could be Mao, with his vision, it could be communism, etc. But what happens when you see that is then there's a brushstroking of everyone if you don't understand that society. We see that coming to a head with Park 51. Park 51 is the so-called mosque at Ground Zero. So Park 51 comes along after we've had Muslims in this country for decades, after we've now had mosques in this country for decades, after Islam has become the third largest of the world's religions. It comes along at a time when Muslims are no longer the way ethnic Italians were or ethnic Catholics were, or any other group that came, Jews, etc. That is, in the first stages of trying to fit in, being maybe in the lower echelon of recognition in society. But when, in fact, in the last decade or so, Muslims have become, and I'll talk about this in a second, economically and educationally fully integrated into the American mosaic and increasingly political. But what does Park 51 produce? Park 51 produces, first of all, people saying it's a mosque at Ground Zero, which it was not. It was planned to be an Islamic center, just as the Jewish Center or the Jewish Y on 92nd Street, which I've spoken at. It's a massive Y. It's been there for decades. Yes, they have a little prayer room, but they also have a swimming pool. They have major lecture series for the community, major projects, programs, etc. This Islamic center was to be not at Ground Zero, but it's in Manhattan near Ground Zero. In fact, there's a mosque closer to Ground Zero, a small mosque existed. It was approved by everybody. But then suddenly, not just some whose families were lost and just felt, okay, it's not at Ground Zero, but I still don't feel comfortable with it. And remember, Muslims died in the towers. I did a talk at a ceremony in which both the husband and wife, who were Muslims, died in the towers. But there are legitimate reasons in the sense you can understand why somebody can feel really uncomfortable. But it was outsiders that came in, people like Pamela Geller and others, who I would call Islamophobes. That is, people who have a problem with Islam and with most Muslims, okay? They came along and led major demonstrations and referred to this Islamic center as the mega mosque at Ground Zero. Okay? What did that issue in? I'm not going to get into that whole debate. What it issued in right after it was a tsunami of anti-mosque activities across the United States. Mosques being victims of hate crimes, vandalism. A mosque in Tennessee that existed for decades, suddenly people in the community, certain people in the community were saying, well, we ought to infiltrate them to see whether or not they have weapons. So this goes from New York to California. And the Sharia frenzy. The Sharia is coming. It's coming to America. Some 29 states have attempted to introduce anti-Sharia legislation. The first was Oklahoma. 76% of the population voted in a referendum. Probably 75% didn't even know what Sharia was. They probably thought it was a Muslim woman who was dangerous. I'm doing a book for Oxford University Press called What Everyone Needs to Know About Sharia and dedicating it to Michelle Botman, Rick Santorum, and I mean, they're the leaders in this frenzy. What's his face? He was the speaker, Newt Gingrich. Newt Gingrich gave a speech in which he said early on, and that helped set it off, the federal government, if I get into office, the federal government should pass anti-Sharia law. I remember when I saw it, I thought, where's this coming from? I mean, I don't know any group that's trying to introduce Sharia. I don't even know if he knows exactly what Sharia is. I mean, the fact is, Jews live according to the Torah. Christians live according to what they see as God's law. And Muslims do too. Not in terms of talking about beheading people, etc., but they pray 5 times a day. That's Sharia. They fast, they whatever. Michelle Botman jumped on board. Rick Santorum gives major speeches across the country on this anti-Sharia. But 29 states about a non-existing issue. It's an interesting, phenomenon. I mean, try to wrap your head around it again. I mean, I often say, some of the students who heard me speak at 3:30, you can fall asleep for the next 3 minutes because I'm going to say, I often say I have the best job in the world, and I really do in the sense of it's also the most frustrating. I've been doing talks and writing for 40 years. I've been dealing with diplomats, consulting all over European governments, etc., and I'm asked the same questions all the times about Islam. Is Islam a more violent religion than other religions? How about the Prophet Muhammad? How could he be a prophet? He was a warrior. David, let me guess. Joshua, let me see. I mean, it's almost like people haven't read the Bible. And I also get this often from ministers who come from a faith dimension and see the Bible literally, and somehow they bypass all of the passages in the Bible that deal, with violence. What about Muslim women? Well, what about Muslim women? Let's talk about, what about Western women until recently? When I taught at Holy Cross, I was teaching a course. Now, this was 23 years ago, and a student shaking his head. And he's in the front. I said, what's the problem? He said, you're talking about issues that your generation solved. Race, gender. This is 23 years ago. This was a bright kid, All right. So, there we are with Park 51 and the fallout from Park 51. What does that reinforce when we talk about the future of Islam in America and in Europe? It makes us think about the issue of, is there a problem in Europe and America? A problem not with terrorists, because there is a problem with terrorism. We have that problem. But is there a problem with dealing with the religion of Islam and the vast majority of Muslims? Well, again, if you look at events that are occurring, for example, I don't know how many of you know this, there was something on the internet about 3 days ago, which then got pulled, but now I've retrieved it, put out by a Christian pastor who runs a Christian group, in which he basically said, he was writing about ISIS, and he said, ISIS equals the religion of Islam. It's no different. It's like Franklin Graham saying Islam is evil, okay? ISIS equals the religion of Islam. Muslims have always killed people through the centuries. The choices they always gave was conversion or killing. So what can we do? Well, we have 2 choices. Conversion, but it doesn't quite look like it, or killing them all. When accused of advocating genocide of 1.6 billion people, suddenly that piece got pulled. But the fact is, that kind of thing is out there. Now, can you imagine saying that about Jews? African Americans today? You might have been able to say stuff about African Americans and see it in the media when I was growing up. But editors today would not print certain kinds of things because they know they could be accused of being racist or anti-Semitic or even anti-Catholic, etc. But that kind of discourse still exists out there. You have what I call preachers of hate. The preachers of hate are not just religious preachers. They're also politicians who do it in order to be elected. Look at the presidential elections, 2008, 2012. Look at the congressional elections in 2010. Islam became an issue. Is President Obama a Muslim? Raised a Christian, says he's not a Muslim, but he's Barack Hussein Obama. Then the birther question. Then you provide the documents. I don't believe the documents. President goes to speak in New York, and in relation to Part 51, he does not advocate the building of the center, but he says in America, every group, and certainly every religious group, if it gets clearance from the local community, if it follows the laws, can do what they want. The next day, you see a spike of 10 to 12% more people who are convinced he's a Muslim. A poll done recently, you have a large percentage who not only think he's a Muslim, you have a large percentage that aren't sure whether he's not a Muslim. And then a smaller percentage that says, no, he probably isn't. This is really bad, what I'm going to say. But I have a black sense of humor. By black, I mean dark. President goes on the Colbert Show after he leaves office. He's interviewed by Colbert. Colbert asks him the question, and he says, Bismillahi ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Now, what happens? You see, I mean, it's this incredible, because you remember what General Powell said. So, suppose he were, and then he gave the example of that young Muslim soldier, who died. But I mean, when you're talking that way, you're in fact, you're saying a certain kind of thing. Now, some of us can be a little aware of this. I was Italian-American. I'm passing from the scene. Okay, you better have a hearse ready. When I was growing up, people always thought I knew about the mafia, that I had members of my family that were mafia. I mean, all the time. I mean, they say you're from Brooklyn. Turns out I was from a relatively mafia neighborhood, but they didn't know that. But, the whole idea, in those days, some of you are old enough to remember, when you saw somebody who was a gangster, when you saw somebody who was slapping women around, etc., they were usually dark and swarthy. If they didn't portray them as Italian, that's what they were. And occasionally they were lovers, but, But the reality of it was, Italian Americans were seen, because of the mafia issue, for many, it was always they used to try to get us in our neighborhoods to get on buses to protest outside the FBI, because we felt that we were being seen in a certain way. This is ironic, by the way, because J. Edgar Hoover thought Catholics were the best people to have as FBI agents. We were clean-cut, short hair, took orders really well, in those days, from the Pope and the Catholic Church, and very disciplined. But this is the kind of brushstroking that we are dealing with, that then winds up affecting, when you have a problem with Islamophobia, it winds up affecting the civil liberties of Muslims. So when we then talk about, for example, our reaction to 9/11, listen to these statistics. This comes from Less Safe, Less Free, by one of the foremost authorities on human rights in America, David Cole. It's a great read, Less Safe, Less Free. By its own account, the U.S. government immediately locked up over 5,000 foreign nationals in preventive detention. 5,000. Not with any showing cause at that point. In the first 2 years after, 8,000 Arab and Muslim men were brought in for FBI interviews, and 80,000 Arab and Muslim foreign nationals for special registration, fingerprints, and photographing. Out of 93,000 in that action, the government's record was 0. Not one convicted of a terrorist act. That doesn't mean that we didn't have then domestic terrorists. But in terms of that initial, in other words, that overreaction where we didn't operate with habeas corpus, in effect, you had people saying, just as in the war itself, you had people saying just war doesn't count. That's from the past. You had a Harvard professor arguing, maybe we need to revisit what torture, the use of torture, etc., that kind of exceptionalism. Now let me deal with media. Yeah, we're okay on time. What role does media play? I can move around, right? Okay, so a lot of times people don't want you to move around. Oh, I forgot. I always tell audiences this. When I finish, don't applaud right away. Stand up first. No. I wasn't going to say that. When I finish, I'm going to move quickly into the audience. Okay? I'm going to lay my hands on 4 people. They're the 4 people who, as I speak, I use eye contact, I believe are really listening. When I lay my hands on you, you will be cured of any disease you have. Now, you may think this is, no, wait. You may laugh and say, he laid his hands on me, he thought he cured me, I didn't have a disease. No, I know you may not. It's a chit. When you have a disease, visualize my face, you will be cured. When that happens, send me an email, because we have a great Pope, and if I can get 2 miracles, I become a saint. Now, think about that. Let's talk about media. For most of us, we get our news from media. In the old days, it was print and TV. Now it's very much social media, but it's media. Okay? Here's a study done by a major group called Media, M-E-D-I-A, Tenor, T-E-N-O-R. You can look this right up, this outfit on the internet. They monitor mass media in Europe and the US every day. All the stories, sort them out, all the different topics of the stories, okay? In 2001, they looked at 975, they looked back at 2001 and at 2012. Okay, so they looked at 975,000 pieces of media, print media. 975,000. In 2001, in trying to understand when they covered the Muslim world, Muslims, Islam, terrorism, etc., 2% covered extremism, 0.1% mainstream Muslim world. So context for most Americans in 2001, if you had no background, is 0.1% of media is doing anything, and 2%, okay? 2012, the 2% jumps to 28%, exponential growth, and mainstream media coverage is, anybody care to guess? 0.1%. Doesn't change at all. 975,000 pieces of media. So if you're somebody looking at media, you're like my mom when I first taught in Boston, and I was raised in New York, and my mother says the first morning I come down, she says, you can't live here. I said, why? She put the news on in the morning, first thing you see are the murders in Boston. I moved to Washington, even worse. She reacts. Now my mother's raised in New York. There are people who don't go to New York because they worry about, but see, my mother knows New York. She knows the good neighborhoods. She's got the context in which to understand. If you're looking at media and the stories that you're seeing are primarily of, as on weekends when things are slow and you see a train wreck in God knows where and you wonder, it's terrible, but why am I looking at this, or there isn't much action taking place. Think about the way that hits the image, and then think about the way in which it affects and brushstrokes, and you run into the danger that the action of a group of terrorists gets explained in terms of the whole faith. When you have ministers or priests or followers of Protestantism or Catholicism, and they engage in abortion bombing, we don't say that's what they all do. When you have cults that are started by Christians or Jews, etc., we immediately distinguish that from the mainstream faith. You don't say, there go those Catholics again. There go those, whatever group that group belonged to. But we still are not able to do that after these years. Yes, we have terrorist actions, but we're not able. Look at the Balkan Wars. Religion was used in the Balkan Wars. Catholicism by the Croats, Orthodoxy by the Serbs, who were responsible for Srebrenica, the thousands of people, the genocide that took place in the Balkans. But we wouldn't sit back and as those of us that are Christian and say, it's legitimate to say that's Christianity. They may have been told by some of their priests, that this is what you should be doing. So in terms of
the future of Islam in Europe and America, one of the things that we do see is an exponential growth in what we call Islamophobia. That's anti-Islam or anti-Muslim. That doesn't mean being critical of Islam. You can be critical of Islam as long as you've got, reasons for it. You can be critical of Islamic practices. You can be critical of, but it is a bias, it's discrimination, it's engaging in hate speech, which can lead to other kinds of incidents. And we've seen that. Look at the number of Sikhs that have been attacked or killed because people think that they're Muslim, which is interesting. They're not even saying what they're saying is we think they're Muslim, and if they're Muslim, that means they're terrorists. You see? So that's one of the challenges of the future of Islam. But the future of Islam is also Islam itself. So I'm going to go for about 10 more minutes, okay? I love listening to my voice. It's just, you get to an age where, why listen to anybody else's voice? I mean, my mother said I didn't like to read. I also have my own version, not seriously, but I can't pay attention to most people. It's just, I don't know what it is. But I'm riveted by myself. Challenge that many Muslims face today is not whether or not they denounce terrorism. For the first 8 years after 9/11, I'd always have people say, why didn't Muslims denounce it? You can go on websites. University of North Carolina has a whole website on this. From 9/11 on, in the New York Times, 1 week after the attacks, there was a full-page ad, put out by a Western think tank, but with all prominent Muslim leaders denouncing the acts of violence. ISIS being denounced. But you don't see it in the media. If you look on the internet, you can find it. These statements go out. Media tend not to publish it. Tom Friedman, who writes for the New York Times, had served in the Middle East, great columnist. He's written twice about the idea that Muslims don't speak up. And his own newspaper has had these denunciations. But that's not what Muslims face today. For many Muslims, on the one hand, if they are in Europe and America, it is feeling that one is that mosaic, is part of that mosaic. I mean, if you think about it, Muslims are, and I have a little thing here, I like to give stats. The great thing now is that we have data. You don't have to rely, if you listen to me, you don't have to say, oh, well, that's what he says, but I can listen to another talking head that says the opposite, and they have the same credentials. Okay. 4 out of 10 Americans, no, we'll skip that. Let's look at a Muslim profile. Muslims span the professional profile. They come from 68 different countries. Professionally, they're doctors, lawyers, engineers, educators, taxi drivers, small business owners. 70% report they have a job compared to 64% overall of Americans. Educationally, 40% of Muslims have college degrees versus 29% of Americans overall. 40 versus 29. Muslim women are statistically as likely as Muslim men to hold college degrees and postgraduate degrees, and to be equally employed. Muslims make as much, if not more, than Americans overall. Among non-working Muslims, 31% are full-time students compared to 10% in the general population, 31% to 10%. Family-oriented, 78% are married. Of those, 83% have 1 or more children. So they're integrated economically, educationally. Pluralism, unlike many parts of the Muslim world and some parts of the United States, in terms of Christians as well as others, American Muslims are quite pluralistic. 77% said that Muslims worship the same God as Christians and Jews. 84% said that Muslims should strongly emphasize their shared values with Christians and Jews. And when it came to the acid test of pluralism, this is a Muslim scholar named Abdulaziz Sajidina who writes on pluralism. He said the acid test is whether or not only you're going up, but other people are. Salvation, A majority, 56%, believe that many religions can lead to eternal life. A minority said no. We have that same kind of breakout. in a study done of foundation money and giving, it was discovered that in a 3-year period, 2008 to 2011, $119 million went to people who some of us would identify as writing Islamophobic literature. Literature that encourages bias, discrimination, or hate. These people, by the way, are cited in, you know, the Norwegian terrorist, you remember a few years ago, they're cited in his manifesto, many of these people, cited many, many times. They run things like Jihad Watch, etc., but they also run things that sound nice, like Pajama Media, American Thinker, Family Security, you know, okay. But 119 million. Now, nobody makes up that statistic because it's based on IRS reports, okay? And there's another study that shows another 42 million. So we're conflating it. That's an enormous amount of money being put into creating websites, being put into disseminating information, writing, you know, books that deal with this kind of situation. So the irony is that Muslims are integrated, but in terms of their civil liberties, there's still an issue. But the irony is that American Muslims are more optimistic than the average American about their future in the next 5 years. Why? Because they're not only doing well, but their second and third generation kids are getting good educations and moving ahead. But a majority also say that either they or friends worry about or have experienced being harassed, infiltration of mosques, being approached and asked to spy, being threatened if you don't spy. Look at the NYPD reports that occurred. It's all over the internet. For European Muslims, it's a bit different. European Muslims, unlike American Muslims, see, most Muslims in America in the early stages were people who fled here for political asylum or to do better economically. Then in the 70s, many countries sent their students, best and brightest, to America to get an education. Many didn't go back. So, in fact, we have a very high cut, you know, educationally. If we talk about the future of Islam, though, the future of Islam is also involved with the politics of the Muslim world. And here it gets very tricky. You know, remember after 9/11, people said, why do they hate us? Now, there's no problem with that question if you mean, why do the terrorists hate us? But for a lot of Americans, why do they hate us meant they, the Muslims. And often, there was no distinction between being anti-American foreign policy or anti-British foreign policy, for example, as in the invasion of Iraq, and being anti-America. And so some people would say, well, why do they still keep coming here? Why do they live here? Well, because they don't hate us, they don't like our foreign policy. You look at statistics. Gallup did a survey looking at comparing America to Canada. We call Canada America without American foreign policy. And the statistics are incredibly different. Or just Europe and America. Britain, Blair, and Bush, their statistics versus other European leaders. In other words, it's around foreign policy. It's around two things. One, invasion and occupation, and two, a feeling that the promotion of democracy, we operate on a double standard. We say that we believe in self-determination, and when we promote democracy all over, including Eastern Europe, but not in the Middle East. And indeed, during President Bush's time, the State Department admitted that under all presidents, Democrat or Republican, we had a policy, a double standard. We did not promote democracy in the Arab and Muslim world. We had chosen deliberately not. Why? Because even though we don't like authoritarian regimes, we work with them if we think they're in our interest. And so we supported Mubarak, we supported Ben Ali in Tunisia, those people that were overthrown. So one of the things that then becomes critical is what happens when we have a coup in Egypt and the President of the United States refused to call it a coup? What happens when you have more violence committed under the current so-called government in Egypt than under Mubarak or any of the predecessors? More violence in the history of modern Egypt, more killing, more slaughter of thousands of people. And we talk about Egypt's on the path to democratization. Now, I'm just trying to give you a sense of how people, wind up perceiving this. Because if we reinstate authoritarian regimes, then the whole sense is we don't have control over our future. We dislike, at a certain point, our government when we get to that point. And then we're not only going to dislike our government, we're going to dislike a government that supports our government, a government that trains our military, that provides weapons. The challenge that Muslims and Christians have, and this is where I'll bring my talk to a close. The challenge that Muslims and Christians and Jews and Americans in general have, and atheists have, is whether we really believe in our principles and values. Do we believe in self-determination? Do we believe in democracy? And do we really believe in pluralism? Political and religious pluralism. For many believers, and certainly for some Christians and Muslims, traditionally, there was a sense, if I'm right, then everybody else is wrong. For Christians and Muslims, there was a sense of a universal mission, each faith. And that's why in the early period, Christianity felt threatened by the new kid on the block, because Islam came along and offered a theological, if you will, an alternative religion, and not only an alternative religion that many people were converting to, but also, like as we had Christendom, so you had, if you will, Islamdom. In other words, the religion was also being expressed not only in a faith and a theology, but also in monarchies and empires. The challenge in our modern globalized world, with globalization and the development of multi-ethnic, multi-religious societies, is the extent to which we can operate on a basis of mutual understanding and respect. Tolerance is out. The old notion of tolerance is useless. I did a program once, and President Clinton was there, and he rejects the term tolerance, because tolerance, remembers, traditionally means coexistence. So I may not like you, I don't want to live near you. In terms of social class, you may not be able to get a good job, the best jobs, have the best upward mobility, but we can coexist. No, in modern societies, there has to be mutual understanding and respect. That doesn't mean that there aren't differences, but you have to make an attempt to understand, and you have to respect the right of people to think differently, both religiously and politically. And unless we do that, we're going to continue to have problems within our societies domestically, as well as within our global politics. Thank you. I don't know, I went in a different direction. So.
We're going to have a question and answer period. We're going to ask you to fill out or write your question out. We have some student helpers going around, some on the left, some on the right. Where are my right guys? Okay. So fill out a form, the card, and we'll bring them up here. We'll go for about a half an hour. And let me start, though, as we start getting the questions here, let me start the questioning by asking the question about ISIS or ISIL. And by the way, ISIS, ISIL, Islamic State of the Levant is where you get ISIL. And it is the more proper translation, actually, because the Arabic, Dawla Islamiyya fil Iraq, was Sham. And Sham in Arabic is both Syria and Lebanon. But I guess who wants to think of the prospect that they actually want to take Lebanon also? So
that is part of the problem. If you look at their statements, they see themselves as not only taking Syria and Iraq, but on their agenda is moving into Lebanon, and in fact there has been some movement into Lebanon, and also moving into to Turkey. So in that sort of immediate area. And I was just speaking in Washington recently, and indeed there is an attraction and some movement in some other countries, like Indonesia, etc.
So The question is that we have to admit that ISIS and radical Salafi jihadism, or whatever you want to call it, this extremism, is a problem in the Muslim world.
Yes.
How do you understand that problem? And the big question is, what should our policy be? After all, we did ask Obama to postpone his talk to 9 p.m. so we could respect John's talk.
I called Michelle. It was no problem.
And he agreed, so you're not going to miss President Obama's presentation of his own strategy. But what would be your advice to how to
Well, the difficulty we have with ISIS, I mean, first of all, when you have deep grievances, and by grievances, it's not just, I don't like this. It's based on reality. That is, when you have situations where tens or hundreds of thousands of people wind up being killed, when you have drones that not only take out terrorists but wind up killing far more civilians, wedding parties, when you have a policy that at one point was stated as, how did it go? If you were looking down and you were looking at somebody between the age of, like, was it 15 and 40 or 45? If they were young people, you could presume that they might be terrorists in terms of a drone attack. You have people that then have grievances, but you also have people who come along and exploit. And in all religions, you do have religious extremists or fanatics. But where there are conditions, they can exploit those conditions. And I think that that's precisely, what we're saying. A group like ISIS will come along and say, look, we've got all these SOBs who are rulers. They're all authoritarian, okay? Therefore, they're not, and then they can pull in the religion thing and say, therefore, they're not good Muslims, they're not legitimate. Who supports them? In the past, it's Western governments, providing them with aid, selling them weapons, training. By we, I mean Europeans and Americans, have trained police, military, for other countries. And where are we? They'll continue to support, quote, our people are repressed. Then when there is a moment of liberation, then it gets crushed again, and the military comes back into power, as it were, in Egypt. And so what you wind up then is taking advantage of that and also saying, you see, democracy doesn't work because you can't do it because our governments are security states, which means that they have strong militaries, strong police, strong security services, so you can't rise up easily. And then if you do, you have to worry about the fact that you're not going to be supported by outside powers. I ran, right after the Arab Awakening, we ran a conference in Istanbul. And the two things that people said, we brought a lot of young people from the different countries, as well as people who were, participating within the uprising. The two things they were concerned about were, number one, what they call the deep state. In other words, how are you going to change? As one of them said, they said, when the French Revolution occurred, all the bad guys are rounded up and they're guillotined. 40,000 people were beheaded post the French Revolution. You're talking about beheading, okay? In other words, the bad guys get rounded. They said, in our case, we've driven out rulers, but the bureaucracy, the main economic players, the military, the courts, are all people who've been, supplied by the other side. So they worry about the deep state. And then the other thing was, how about the West? Will the West accept, or will they actually support a counter coup? And so I think an outfit like ISIS works off that. And then domestically, they work off also the fact that a Sunni-Shia rivalry. In Iraq, remember that in Iraq, you had a ruler who was Sunni, and the Sunnis are the largest number of Muslims in the world, some 85%. Shia are about 15. But in Iraq, Sunnis were a minority with the elite positions ruling over Shia. And so there's a deep animosity there, and Sunnis felt completely disenfranchised by the last prime minister, who was Shia. And so that's where ISIS could look for support from Sunni villages that would support them in both going after the Shia, but also talking about empowering the Sunnis. So there's no doubt that that's part of the challenge. The challenge the president has is, what do you do about, what's your action going to take? What kind of military action? And if you use it, you know, how carefully do you use it? So that it doesn't look like Western countries are coming in. And I think that's why tonight he's going to announce the equivalent of an armada. What I mean by that is, hopefully he's going to announce that there's going to be a movement against, that he's got the support of countries in the region, some of the countries which he needs, countries like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, let's say Egypt, maybe even Iran, maybe Iraq, along with European countries, maybe Australia. But then even their actions have to be done very, very carefully, because we are, from an American point of view, we're still seen as the world's great power. So if there's any big screw up, there's still going to be the sense that, you know, the Americans are calling the shots, as it were.
Kind of a follow-up of that, we have Boko Haram in Nigeria. You have, of course, Qaeda, which doesn't seem to be going away. What's the prospect of them? You talk about the future of Islam.
Yeah.
What is
the future
their
of,
future? What's happening?
As long as you have conditions that combine, from my point of view, authoritarian governments, and you know, that phrase doesn't really sink in. About 20 years ago, I was on a panel in Washington, and I said to my colleagues, do you realize this is the first panel that we've probably been on as professionals who deal with the Middle East, where we were talking about democracy in the Middle East? In other words, there was just a presumption that there was no democracy, that the states were security states, you know? When you talk about security state, you're talking about state control. Not only of jobs, of your life ultimately, but also of the use of force and violence. So you're talking about thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of people in prison, being tortured. You also hold back the development of education. Until economies are strengthened, until you have, you know, greater education, these groups will continue. Terrorism is with us. The question is not whether you can eliminate it, it's whether you can limit and contain it. And I think that, you know, that's just something that we, you know, that we're dealing with.
Does Sharia contradict democracy?
Not necessarily. It depends on your interpretation of Sharia. For example, I'm going to do this analogously. If you asked me, did Catholicism contradict democracy, I would have to tell you that a whole series of popes condemn modernity, democracy, notions of women's rights, I mean that is equality, and freedom of speech in terms of free media as anarchy. And you had papal bulls given for that. We have encyclicals, but we also have bulls. I like the phrase bull when I don't like something that has been said. But, you know, condemning, right? We now accept democracy. With Vatican II, we accept religious pluralism, meaning that before that, we really didn't accept religious pluralism fully. When it comes to Sharia, what we find in Gallup is that the vast majority of Muslims in the world want democracy, but they don't want Western secularism. They do want Sharia, but they mean different things by it. So for many of them, what they really mean is, we want the principles and values of our religion. It doesn't mean that they necessarily want specific interpretations of that by human beings, specific formulations from the past for punishing people. In the past, as I said, we in the West, we did beheading. We put people who owed even small amounts of money in Britain for long periods of time. We've moved beyond that. And so part of the debate over areas of Islamic law are, if you have Islamic laws that were developed in the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th century, when you had different standards of let's say, punishment, how you approach certain crimes, do they have to change today? And one final point. You know that whole thing about The Prophet married very young women. Aisha, some of you have heard this, one of his wives might have been anywhere from 10 or 12 to 14. The fact is that in the past in the Roman Empire, you had a same approach to marriage in terms of the age for women. In other words, the age when somebody was seen as, having entered in or gone through puberty and could now conceive and get married, etc. You move into a different situation, you move into different cultural situations, and then one talks about changing, realities. Can you have Sharia and democracy? I think Tunisia is a perfect example of it. The Islamic movement there won. They implemented democracy. They not only implemented, they announced ahead of time that the president would not be a member of their group. They announced that if they were elected, they would bring in the next 3 political parties that were socialist and secularist and don't like them at all. That's worked out. But it all depends on what your interpretation is.
Many of the questions asked, how can we better promote mutual understanding and respect of Islam and Muslims in America, or how can we help address the issues of Islamophobia and misunderstanding that is also often portrayed in classrooms?
I think, there's so much, I can't talk when I'm sitting. I'm sitting on my brains. The reality of it is there's so much that one can do. I've been doing this for years, and this is all going to sound, if you want to have any impact in life, remember that movie that they talked about, Pay It Forward? Some of you remember, okay? I always say, if you want to be useful in life, if you go through tough times and then you're blessed and you have a pretty good job, or you're in a position to help somebody else because somebody helped you, or you have some money and you can help them, you pay it forward. But you can't do what everybody else can do, even when you're talking about paying it forward. You're not Bono, You're not, some mega wealthy person who just walks in and says, we all in our everyday lives have a way of paying it forward. There are people who are lonely, there are people who are sick, there are people who just want somebody to come and talk to them. There are things like, delivering, food to people. And people can do that and make incredible contributions. And they don't get on TV. They're not somebody who can say, I've got 100 million and I'm going to give 10 million tomorrow and it's going to be in the newspapers. The same thing is true with cultural understanding. I speak at universities, I speak to groups, and then I go back. And it's amazing how many people come up to me and they'll say something like, I heard you speak 10 years ago and you suggested X and Y, and some of us went out and did that. Whether it's a career, or I said at one point to a group, I said, develop a book club. There are book clubs all over the place, where people in a community, men and women, or sometimes it'll be women who are at home during the daytime, they get together and they read a book, they discuss culture and religion, they get to know each other, they get involved in their communities, they get involved in each other's mosque or church. And when you do that and then there's a crisis, when somebody attacks a mosque or whatever, and we've had incidents of this where suddenly people come out of nowhere who aren't Muslim and help out. At universities, get speakers, get interactive programs. Not only have courses, have discussion groups, and deal with hard issues. One shouldn't be afraid to say, look, I have nothing against your religion. I know most Muslims are okay, but how come there are so many terrorist groups? How come there's so much violence? Now, I have a weak-kneed answer to some of that. If you had 10 Northern Islands and Southern Islands, you'd be saying, what are those Catholics doing? If you had 10 Israels and Palestines, you'd be saying, what's going on between all of these people? In other words, when you look at an area, okay, those areas are one country, or vying over, whether it's one or two countries in Northern Ireland. Okay? When you're dealing with some 35 or 40 countries across the world that are very diverse, that have had authoritarian regimes, that have a legacy of European colonialism, okay, that's part of it. Also, people are responsible for changing their own future. But how do you change your own future if you're functioning with an authoritarian regime where you can't have political parties, maybe, where you can't organize? In the new democracy in Egypt, you cannot meet and talk without permission from the government, even in the smallest possible groups. You have no access to television. You have no access to, and it affects the educational system. If you don't have a good educational system, if you don't have a good economy, all of those things come to play. But in discussion groups, these things can be honestly raised because one should be able to raise that. You know, being culturally sensitive or religiously sensitive doesn't mean I don't want to say anything because that could upset the other person. But let's face it, it is sensitive. In our culture and religion today, it's sensitive. Look at Shout Television. Look at O'Reilly. Look at Sean Hannity. And look at some people on MSNBC. It's attack television. And in attack television, there is no mutual understanding. When you have attack television, and when you have attack media, and when you have attack social media, then you don't have that. And I think that that's part of it.
Question about Egypt. You called the overthrow of Mohammed Morsi as a coup. The writer of the question says that only the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt believes it was a coup. How do you?
First of all,
go over your understanding.
That's not true. Let me just make this very clear, okay? All you've got to do is read your modern press. But look at New York Times, look at The Economist, look elsewhere. One of the new things that's happened now is that many of the young people, many of whom were part of the original Tahrir Square, many of whom actually initially supported intervention, are now being imprisoned by the current government, are now being imprisoned. They were social media leaders, youth leaders, journalists, etc., are being imprisoned. As this government is playing out, you see, initially, it was very easy in a way. What you do is you target and you pick one group, and you don't just say they're really bad politics, you say they're terrorists, which, by the way, has never been proven. In fact, the Muslim Brotherhood functioned for 30 years when they came out of prison and rebuilt themselves for 30 or 35 years, okay, in which the government arrested thousands of people. This is all, the great thing today is you have access to all this information. Imprison them, torture them, prevent people from running for office, etc., and never return violence for violence, okay? So, you can say Morsi was a lousy leader, okay, if that's what you believe. But the way we get rid of lousy leaders is through elections. A representative of John Kerry, the Secretary of State, a woman ambassador, was speaking before our congressional committee. And she was, the person said, how come we don't call it a coup, the member of Congress? And then he said, and how come we support what's going on now? You're saying they're on a democracy path. To which she said, well, we're supporting the fact that so many people wanted to see Morsi out. To which he said, I can think of American presidents that had the same problem. The stats on George W. Bush, for some Americans, the way he was elected, let alone at times when his stats went down, Obama in the last couple of months, what's the threshold? When a president drops below 40 or 30%, do we then say the military should step in and we should come in? And who's really come in? Your general retires, the military and the courts are completely controlled. And in fact, if you look at human rights reports, major international human rights reports, so it's not just dealing with the question of the Muslim Brotherhood, per se. And that's part of the problem. I mean, it's part of the problem. If we don't have an informed public, then we'll believe whatever some congressperson says, however right or wrong they are. I mean, Michelle Bachmann jumped on a plane, went to Egypt with a couple of other congresspeople, and said to the new coup leaders, we're here representing the Congress. She wasn't representing the Congress, she was representing herself as a congressperson, giving the impression, we America coming to you and saying, yeah, we support what you're doing. I think those are the things, It's information we need to get out. It's getting information out. And so I really think that everybody in this audience can do something if you want to do it. Even if you're a private person, there are certain things that some of us don't do. Just learn more yourself so you're a more informed citizen, so that when you go to vote, in the old days, we'd let it go. After 9/11, Joe Biden, our vice president, who was head of the Foreign Relations Committee, asked myself and somebody else to come in, and I didn't know Joe Biden. I haven't seen him since then. I'm not dropping names here, okay? Although I played basketball with Obama. No. Joe Biden asked us to explain what was going on, and after it he said, which is very interesting, Biden is a very self-assured person. Very bright, very intelligent. He said, I have to admit, and I got this, right after 9/11, I briefed a whole mess of congressmen and senators, and Lugar was there, and Kerry was there when they were senators. They were all in the audience, okay? Why were they there? Well, for the simple reason of what Biden said. For most of our senators and congressmen, they're very busy people, so they have a staff. The staff does research, they give them the research, they tell them what position looks good, they give them a rationale, they read it, they go, and they represent it. And so one of the things he said is, I know nothing about the Middle East. In depth, he said, I know Europe really well, because we really deal. He said, when it comes to Islam in the Middle East, didn't know much. And the kinds of questions I was getting from Kerry and some of the others, and Lugar, who are informed people, but when it came to the role of religion in politics, they just weren't, they weren't, on top of it. So everybody can play a role in wherever you are. You can just use your imagination, whether it's to be a more informed voter, whether it's to put together a discussion group, whether it's to, get yourself into more multicultural situations. It's like the civil rights movement. There were people who could march in streets and deal with that. I don't just mean African Americans, I mean, non-African Americans. And there were some people who just knew they couldn't do that, but they could support it by writing columns in newspapers, they could support it by, you name it. Let's just do two more, because they've been very patient. One more.
One more. Many, many great questions, but we just don't have time. A few of the questions asked about the fact that there are Muslims from America and from Europe who are joining ISIS.
Yeah.
Who are adopting this terrorist mentality. How do you evaluate that danger?
Yeah.
What to do?
I think that is a danger. I was a member of the European Commission's, I can never remember this. I even have it on my CV and I can't remember. The European Commission's, the equivalent of Commission on Radicalization. There were two Americans that were part of that. So we were looking at the European situation from about 2004 or 5 to about 2008. 4 different countries. What radicalized youth. Then you've got the American situation. Remember I said that you've got different socioeconomically, your position in society, okay? That means you're going to have much more alienation in Europe, right? If in fact your grandfather, when a lot of people came to Europe, they were workers who were welcomed as workers and weren't expected to stay. And what a lot of the workers who came, they were workers who came to work and didn't expect to stay. And they were workers often from rural areas coming in to do the more menial jobs. Okay? Now you stay and you need to work your way up. The society wasn't prepared to deal with the kinds of things that you need to deal with to help people get the skills, the education, the skills, but also to make your own society multicultural. Remember, many European countries were basically white and one language, maybe 2. And so suddenly now to deal with people who represent other religions, other cultures, and absorb them, and who also are, let's say, less educated. So then what do you wind up thinking? I grew up as an Italian American in which the image was that we were not people who were going to go to college or university, or certainly we would go to Catholic universities, but not that we would be going to a Harvard or a Yale. And you can read, there are statistics on this with regard to Harvard at a certain point, where Jews and ethnic Catholics, and this is true for other groups too, okay, had problems getting into these places because there was a presumption that they just look at your pedigree. Oh, your parents didn't even make it through high school? Or, you know what I mean, that whole kind of situation. So part of the problem that you see is that, for example, in some situations, in some countries, you have young people who feel alienated. They're not making it in the system. They read the newspapers. They see what on TV, what Islamophobes are saying. They see what the first woman, Muslim, to hold a senior cabinet position in the UK, and who's also a member of the House of Lords, Baroness Wolsey, said, which was, and it caused a stir in England. And she was minister for like ethnic and religious minorities. She said, when it comes to Muslims, Islamophobia has become acceptable dinner talk. People went bananas. Because, she was sort of saying, do we have Islamophobia? Acceptable dinner talk. It's like some of us who are older remember in some of our families, there could be racial slurs or anti-Semitic stuff that would just be said, and nobody at the table would look, It caused a stir. Okay? All right. She herself, who's a member of the Conservative Party, remember, okay, resigned recently her cabinet position because she disagreed with her government not being more proactive on what was going on in Gaza. Okay. Now, she's an elite in the society. Now you get kids who aren't making it, and they're looking at the newspapers, they're looking at the media, they're seeing the way in which they are portrayed as a people, and they don't have to be particularly religious. You see, if you're a cultural Jew or a cultural Catholic, meaning you might not be, let's say, observant, but you come out of the culture and you still identify a lot. If somebody's ridiculing who you are and saying you're second class and brushstroking everything, you can become alienated. And a lot of folks get caught up in that. What's very interesting is that a lot of them do not, as from the United States too, they go and fight in foreign countries. So you had young Somalis who went to Somalia. They didn't turn on their own community. So it's dealing with a sense of oneself, a sense of alienation, and then a sense of what's happening. And I'll end with this. This is Gallup data. Why do they hate us? Vast majority of Muslims, when asked, about America, said what they didn't like, and I told you that already. Okay, double standard with democracy, invasion. What did they admire about us? They admire our country, our democracy, our freedoms, our rule of law, our technology, and our work ethic. All the things that non-Muslim Americans said in surveys that they admired about themselves, okay? But one of the things they really didn't like was the belief that Islam and Arabs and Muslims are denigrated, that they're looked down upon, that there isn't a level playing field, and that their blood is cheap, that their lives are cheap. And that's when you get into things like looking at Iraq or Afghanistan and realizing that we can account for every American who's been killed or wounded. And yet when the administration was asked during the Bush period about numbers of Iraqis who were being killed, we'd always say, oh, we don't have numbers. Oh, we can't keep track of them. And yet when Johns Hopkins or some other outfit would come out with a number, the government would say, oh, those numbers are totally inflated. How can you know if numbers are completely inflated? Because nobody wanted to talk about the incredible numbers of people who were being killed and maimed. And unless you're saying you are concerned about those numbers, if you're not paying attention to it, then it means, well, this is easy stuff to do. And that's why the idea of using the military is going to be really tricky. We're going to need to have a lot of allies who work with us. Thanks for staying so long.
Thank you very much.